when I first told them that I wanted to do theater, again, I can only imagine how I broke their hearts and how painful that must have been. Because for a lot of, especially marginalized communities, like, what? You want to work in an industry that we know nothing about, we know no one at, and everyone that we know who's tried to make it can't? Like, come on, you're setting yourself up for failure. And that's what they were most concerned by. But when they saw that I was being successful, at least in the theater and acting stuff, one of the biggest and most powerful things that they ever did for me was when I was nominated to compete for a national acting competition. I was nominated by my school, and then I was nominated by my region, and I eventually end up at the Kennedy Center performing for a national acting title, 2 blocks from Homeland Security. I'm an undocumented student at this time, so that's very intense. And my parents took their first vacation in this country after 14 and a half years, their first vacation, to fly out to Washington, D.C. and watch me perform. That act alone, it makes me very emotional talking about it, because think about how much they had to save to make that trip. Think about how much they had to come to terms with, okay, he's not going to be a doctor or a lawyer, so let's support him. And the third thing is, like, they are flying into the Lion's Den. They are undocumented immigrants flying to Washington, D.C., to our nation's capital. It wasn't easy for them. They just needed a really good excuse to do it. And that excuse was their son. I always knew that I wanted to honor my parents' journey and sacrifice to this country by writing their story. And I always thought it'd be funny and relatable if I can write it as a coming of age story, essentially my coming of age story. And I started the manuscript a while back, but I constantly like picked it up and left it. But that's because of my obligations in the TV world and all like the deadlines I have over here and all the shows I was working on. And then I have to admit that the pandemic hit, and when Hollywood closed its doors, and it was like 9 months of not being able to work or pitch or take anything out, I was like, oh my God, this is it. This is my time. And I wrote frantically, and I just wrote and wrote and wrote until I had my manuscript. It was a hard transition going from a TV writer to an author. And thank God for my editor and my publisher, Suzanne at Grand Central Publishing, Suzanne O'Neill. She's so amazing. She was the one who first highlighted, Rafa, you're kind of writing like every chapter is an episode of TV. I was like, yeah, every chapter is a theme. Every chapter is what lessons did I get? And they're like, yeah, but you're telling an overarching narrative. You have to think about the whole book, not just the chapters. And she was like, and what are you feeling in this moment? You really have to you have to step it out. And I was like, I can't just write cut to and go to the next chapter and go to the next page like I do in TV. She's like, no, we want to live with you and your thoughts and your feelings. I was like, oh, wow, okay, let's go. I had learned to be so economical in my TV and film writing, right? So that was a learning experience for me. Well, this is so funny. I wrote this book in hopes that I can make like undocumented students or undocumented immigrants or just like Latinos in the United States are trying to make it. Like I was thinking of them, but the people who have most reached out to me since the book has been published are first generation Americans. I've received so many messages from like Indian Americans and Chinese Americans and Filipino Americans who are like, that is my story. That is my fight with my parents. That is like everything about it. And I was like, wow, I didn't even think about writing a first generation story. And that's essentially what I did. The children of immigrants is the one group who has most resonated with this book. Ultimately, what I did do was I was able to bring the heart, the warmth, and the storytelling that I had on Jane the Virgin. So when people read the book, Illegally Yours, they always thank me. They always like, wow, it was so fun to read. And it was It was so funny. And I wanted to do that because I know immigration is such a heavy topic for people. And I knew that if I came at it as a drama or a woe is me like story, I wasn't going to connect with people. I wanted to connect with people through comedy. And yeah, it's what I saw Jane the Virgin do so successfully in TV, and that's what I was trying to do in publishing. And I am so happy that everyone says your mother is my favorite character in the book. I'm like, oh, thank God.
Did they? Are they both still living?
Yes, yes. Both my mom and dad are still living, and
So what
I've
was the moment like? Yeah, what's the moment like when you say, "Hey, here's here's your story"?
yeah. Again, back to the therapy session with Jake Brown. What what really happened was I had sold the the book idea. I got my advance and all that stuff, and I was so happy to sit down and finish this outline of the perfect immigrant family who united and bonded and made it past everything to be successful in this country. And a few months after I got my book deal, my parents got a divorce. And that was, I almost didn't want to finish the book. Completely honest with you, I almost didn't want to finish the book. I started to feel like my story was a farce, and I felt like it was a little dishonest. My agent called me, my editor called me, and I was like, hold on, I'm going through something right now. And that's when I realized that well, I wrote the last chapter of the book first. And it was that last chapter of the book that gave me permission to write the book, because I realized that I had to protect my memories from everybody, including my parents. So I went back and I looked at the manuscript and I rewrote so much of it. And I wanted to hold on to that sense of wonder, of that sense of like love, and I didn't want to pass judgment on either of my parents, knowing what the final outcome was going to be. So all of this to say that when the book finishes, the only person that I had in my life was my mom. And I remember my publisher mailed me the book. I opened it and I gave it to her. And I was like, here, I would love for you to read it before it goes out into the world. And I would hear her in her room, like laughing out loud, like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Oh my God, I can't remember that. And then she got to the end and there was a silence, and she opened the door, she came outside, and she just held me and cried for like what felt like an eternity, but it was like, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And that was it. That was all the validation I needed. Like, as long as my mom loved the book, as long as my mom think I did justice to her and to, like the way she puts it, to every immigrant who comes to this country in search of a better life. That was all I needed.